Okay, then we will continue with our second block, which is a little bit shorter because the first block was a little bit on the long side, I think. We will now have a look at the Egyptian Book of the Dead. We will talk about the origin, function, and some facts, which are nice to know. The creation of the so-called Book of the Dead was preceded by the pyramid texts and the sarcophagus texts. What were the pyramid texts? In the Old Kingdom, that is a period of around 2400 to 2300 BC, and that started in the so-called pyramid of Pharaoh Unas, 5th dynasty, and you can find this pyramid in Saqqara, which is about 1.5 hours drive from the center of Cairo. And the content of this pyramid text focuses on the heavenly worlds, and the text was only intended for initiated pharaohs. And you see on the slide, you see two pictures of the inside of this pyramid, and you can see on the walls a lot of hieroglyphs, and in fact this is all knowledge about the process of initiation. In a later period, this knowledge, which was first in this pyramid text, was also repeated and copied, but then on so-called sarcophagus texts. It was in a later period, in the so-called Middle Kingdom, when these texts were written on the inside walls of sarcophagus, where not only pharaohs but also rich Egyptians were buried after their death. And the content of these texts was spells, mainly meant to protect the deceased in the afterlife, and also to prevent the dying second death. And the Egyptologists really don't understand what was meant with that idea of not dying a second death. But from the Teosophical viewpoint, this is a very known thing and is easily understood, because after laying down the material body, after our material death, there is also a second death according to the Teosofia. It is the death of the so-called Kamarupa or desire body, which is existing for some time, months or sometimes years, after the material body has been laid down, and it is intact for some time after that part of the composition of man is also falling apart. And that was known in the mystery schools. Then from these sarcophagus texts was the next step in the New Kingdom, which was about 1500 to 50 BC, when all this knowledge that was collected in the mystery schools was written on papyrus scrolls, and that were taken into the tombs as a manual how to act in the afterlife. By now it was also available to many wealthy Egyptians. It was in stock and could be ordered, and the only thing that needed to be done was to fill out the name of the one who had the deceased, and depending on the amount of money you could afford, it was a long papyrus or a short one if you couldn't pay so much. So the contents of this papyrus scrolls was a compilation of the pyramid texts and the sarcophagus texts. Although there are from the first dynasties also some fragments left over in the form of papyrus scrolls, but this is basically how the papyrus texts that exist today came into existence. Actually, the name of all these papyruses is called the coming forth by day, or the entering into the light, and describes symbols and records of the processes after death for every human being, and especially, if you know how to read it, the processes of initiation. And the function of the Book of the Dead, as we will start calling it from now on, is twofold. So it is for the ordinary Egyptian, a description of other spheres of existence after death, and for the initiant, it is a description of the transformation and the assessments of the soul during the process of initiation. All figures, objects and animals in the different plates, called vignettes, with as main figure the deceased or the initiate, are symbols for the forces in nature and for aspects of the human consciousness. And in this regard, the whole Book of the Dead is an allegory. There are many versions or recensions, as they are called, of the Book of the Dead, and they are from different time periods. There is, for instance, the Heliopolis recensions, mainly based on the pyramid text, but most of these texts have been lost. Then you have the Theban recension from Thebes, from about 1500 BC. You have the recension from Sais, from about 600 BC. And for most of the knowledge that Egyptologists have, they all relate to the Theban recension, because they are the most complete that are still available. For instance, and I give some details now, the papyrus of Joop found, which is now in the Museum of Turin in Italy, is about an official in the Ptolemaic era, and the historian Lepsius, who found this papyrus, started with numbering of the different chapters in this scroll in 1842, as he thought that all these papyrus would be roughly the same. And all the papyruses after that took over this chapter numbering, but sometimes in other papyruses the orders of these chapters are quite different. So it is let's say, a little bit complicated sometimes to find your way around. Then the most famous one is the papyrus of Ani, a scribe at the court of Pharaoh. This papyrus is 26 meters long. Then we have also the papyrus of Anhai, a singer in the priestly courts of Amon-Ra, which is only 6 meters long, and the papyrus of Hunifer, which is only 4 meters long. Now, as I said, the papyrus of Ani is the most complete version and has been translated by several Egyptologists, including Wallace Budge and Faulkner. And it contains 189 chapters and 37 plates. And there is a remarkable detail about this scroll. In 1888, Wallace Budge bought this papyrus in Egypt, which was then still a British colony. But already in 1877, Madame Blavatsky wrote the book Isis Unveiled, and later in 1888 she issued The Secret Doctrine. And in both works she already wrote extensively about passages in the Book of the Dead, also using it to highlight certain aspects of, for instance, the stanzas in the Secret Doctrine. And you can see that the people who, together with Madame Blavatsky, prepared those books knew and had at their disposal the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Because Wallace Budge only issued in 1890 the first draft of his translation of the Book of the Dead. But then it was already far extensively commented by Madame Blavatsky in these two other books. Then we will have a look at a vision on life and death by the ancient Egyptians. In the mystery schools, one was familiar with the sevenfold composition of man, the seven souls or seven principles of man, which are in accordance with those in the Teosófica. Those were important to understand for the processes after death. For the average man, who goes through those processes more or less in a dream state, but for the initiate, he goes through those processes of the dead self-consciously. Because the ancient Egyptians assumed an eternal life, the goal of every Egyptian believer was to obtain a new life in the other world, that is, in the afterworld, in Amenti. At one point, a degenerate form of the initiation story had taken hold. And that means that also for the average Egyptian, initiation or Osirification, as they called it, would take place automatically, as it were, after physical death. But according to the esoteric teachings, this is not the case. Only the well-prepared initiate is able to experience the processes of death consciously. Moreover, the initiate returns to his own body in this life. He becomes a twice born in his own body, a Dvija, as they say in the East. The Egyptians came to the practice of mummification based on, among other things, the story of Osiris, who was also raised from the dead, and it was taught in the mystery schools that future reincarnation could take place more quickly by keeping one's own so-called life atoms together in the old body. Partly also were these mummification practices ancient practices which once took place in ancient Atlantis according to the Teosófica. But the esoteric origin of this Egyptian idea was an initiation story. That is, that the mummy was not only waiting to be resurrected, but in the meantime, a process of spiritual transformation was taking place. Accordingly, the risen deceased in one of the scriptures says, I have been spiritualized. I have become a soul. I rise as a god. And this reflects the knowledge of the initiation process among the ancient Egyptians, although this knowledge was increasingly degenerating. We are now ready for the second break. We are going to break 3 minutes, so please send in your questions and we will see you after 3 minutes. Mariska, are there any questions?
There are no questions at this moment. No, there are 2 people saying that they think it's a very clarifying speech. So maybe that's why there are no questions now. Or they are holding up for after the 3rd round. We'll see.
Well, I hope you will have some questions after the 3rd round then. We will continue now.